Precisamente el título de nuestra 11ª jornada, Riesgos tecnológicos, regulación y responsabilidad en un mundo globalizado y hiperconectados, ¿no? Pues esto es justo lo que pretendemos hoy, es analizar estos riesgos tecnológicos y, en concreto, los derivados de nuestra dependencia de las tecnologías de la información y comunicación y de los sistemas interconectados, ¿no? Pues esto es ya una de las preocupaciones anuales del World Economic Forum, el Foro Económico Mundial, que en sus últimos informes de riesgos globales ya, pues el último se ha publicado hace unos meses, a final de 2011, ya pues apunta como entre los 5 riesgos globales de mayor probabilidad está el de los ciberataques, entonces pues en definitiva de la ciberseguridad. Esto para nosotros, que ya desde hace 2 años empezamos a colaborar con el World Economic Forum, pues marca un cambio, casi un cambio de paradigmas. O sea, entre los riesgos que todos conocemos, riesgos geopolíticos, de desestabilización financieras, como los que estamos viviendo en estos años, los relacionados con la escasez de recursos, agua y medio ambiente, pues empieza también a destacar su presencia, pues en este mapa de riesgos, los riesgos relacionados con el uso de las nuevas tecnologías, ¿vale? Para ofrecernos las claves de este informe, contamos entre nosotros nada menos que el responsable del informe del Global Risk 2012. Contamos entonces con la estimable presencia del director gerente y máximo responsable del Centro for Global Event and Risk Response Network del World Economic Forum, Lee Howell. Quiero agradecer especialmente su presencia en España. Estábamos hablando antes que siempre hemos estado en España, en el norte, pues en los Pirineos, para otras cosas, no para trabajo. Su punto de vista pues es un gran valor para los que aquí estamos presentes, dada la gran influencia de su organización pues a nivel mundial. Thank you very much for your participation, Leo. Well, please take the place. You're welcome.
Can you hear me? Yes? Oh, great. Thank you. Let me first by thanking the organizers, ISMS. Really, we're sister organizations in a sense. We're a nonprofit foundation in Switzerland with business as a core part of the membership with many partners, but also others, constituents and stakeholders, including government, international organizations, NGOs, the academic world. And it's, I think it's really important because in my work and the function at the forum is, of course, to give a global perspective of these risks, but more importantly, part of my mission is to connect organizations such as this, because we know that that global picture, you need to understand it in a regional or national context. You need to appreciate it in an industry or enterprise context. And so we can really start the conversation, but you continue it. And I like to use sort of the metaphor of, I'm sort of in the global public health field, and here you are, I'm sitting among many consulting physicians who can help in your organization. So I take it in that spirit, the invitation today to be here, and certainly it's a privilege. Just a quick thing about today's objectives. One is, I hope, because coming from Switzerland, to kind of regain some time and get things back on track for you also. So I might be zipping through some things, but certainly there'll be time for take questions. What I wanted to do is first, a brief introduction to World Economic Forum. You're probably aware that actually it's a pretty subsidiary brand. The most famous brand is the annual meeting of the members and constituents of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland at the beginning of the year in January. That happens also to be my other responsibility in terms of its editorial and operational oversight. But it's connected to my risk work because we build an agenda every year where we try to highlight the key global challenges to get the mind share, the attention of our leaders. And here, I think, again, we share very much the same goal and mission of ISMS in the sense that we want to help leaders learn. And part of the exercise is the report we publish every January, the second week of January, 2 weeks before the annual meeting, which is our global risk report, which I'll discuss the 7th edition, and it's significant because I took over that a year ago, and we changed completely the model and the methodology, but of course, building off of the foundation of the prior 6 editions. And I'll go over that briefly because I think it's an important piece of what I hope to impart with you is a conceptual model to look at global and systemic risks. So why did we do this report? It's a really easy question, story to tell, because who would have imagined that on March 11th in Japan, an earthquake that really was 1 in a 1,000-year occurrence. They had been planning all their lives in Japan. I'm from Japan. I'm born and raised in Japan. Would have led to catastrophe, not only in terms of tsunami and the devastation that the earthquake itself put on the people in the prefecture of Fukushima, but also it would lead to a major decisive reversal or acceleration of policy change in Germany and other countries around nuclear policy. So right there you see how interconnected we are. And we also see that as those of you who work for your respective organizations, that you can do your best to understand your risk profile from your operating unit, the geography you operate, and in your sector, but it's hard to fathom and to sort of think about, well, what are the other things that are going to happen in the world that might lead to really an existential crisis in my company or my industry. And that's really part of what the forum is about, is to help you get that big global systemic picture, because it's very hard to actually, A, pick out the dots, B, connect those dots, and C, explain the picture of those connections. And that's what we seek to do. So talk about dots, and I wanted to, is that simply, we started with an exercise each year to go to a pool of 1,200 experts. We have what we call global agenda councils. They're representative from industry, public policy, academia, national governments. And they gather around essentially 88 different global topics. Most of them are global challenges, familiar to you, be it climate change, demographic growth, population growth, but they're also in industries and regions. And we actually do an extensive survey where we first, with different various groups, arrived at 50 risks to look at. We say, look, let's examine them. We're so captured by the quarterly view of the world that we can't take longer. Let's examine them in a 10-year horizon. 10 years, nice round number, but it's also outside of most of the political cycles that we work in today, so political leaders can actually get out of their sort of re-election mindsets and think about it in the longer term. We have 5 categories: environmental, economic, geopolitical, technological, and societal. And of them, we have 10 risks in each, and we look at a 5-point scale. And on this axis, we look at, on the y-axis, on 1 to 5, we ask these experts, tell us what you think the impact is going to be. If you look in a 10-year time horizon, and then we say, look, in a 5-point scale, can you tell us what the likelihood is? Past editions looked at impact and tried to measure it in billions of dollars, loss, etc. And we felt that was a bit problematic because not all these risks, the right metric is really loss. It could be number of lives lost, etc. Moreover, we didn't want to create the sense that, in many of these instances, these risks are difficult to model to begin with, but also they're not insurable. So we're not talking about really trying to assign a dollar value to these things, but just a sense from this expert group. And by the way, in our report, we have all the data about who they are, their profiles. It's a pretty good geographic and industry spread. And we arrived at this map. And you can see in the outermost reaches here, if you can see that, it's chronic fiscal imbalances as something with a high likelihood impact over the next 10 years. And I just illustrate that, we first plot these. Then here's where it gets sort of something probably more familiar to you, is we start the salient question is how do they connect and interact with one another. And that's part of the survey. And of course, we have a team of statisticians, but more importantly, graphic visual designers who can actually make sense of this. But we start to see these constellations of risks. And we'll get to that, and it's a very important piece of our analysis, but you start to see, now it's real dangerous here because everything connects. And that's, in an interdependent, globalized world, that's pretty obvious, but we'll explore the nature of these connections. And here we do have, this is the method of how we break it down. And again, we have the 50 risks there. And we break them in 5 categories. We have a concept called the center of gravity, where we look at each of the 5 risk categories, and we just say, simple question, we're not asking what the most important one is, but of this risk that you look at, which one has the greatest influence on the other risks in your area? So of the 10, which one is actually within that population of risks the most systemically important, or the one that influences the others? And we identify that, and we look at the connections there. Again, what's really important here is that it's a diagnostic, not a predictive tool. Although it's, and we'll be talking about it, we're not looking to predict. We haven't backcasted this, and certainly the point is, though, is that at least give an X-ray of sort of the state of the world and its health at the beginning of the year in its long-term sense. Then we can deep dive into one area, and this is the technological piece that we'll discuss today. Interesting here, I think, as you can see, there's a legend there because some of these we couldn't print out for you, but you can see. But right here, I think this is something you all are concerned about in your day-to-day on the cyber piece, critical systems area. But what's interesting about this piece of the survey in the landscape, and we call this our risk landscape, and it's the technology landscape, two points. One is we ask everyone who takes this survey what their expertise is of the 5 categories. So someone will say, I'm a technology expert, I'm an econ expert, a geopolitical expert. Generally, we have very little. We look at all the bias and tendency in data, but there's one interesting thing about technology that I wanted to share with you. When technology, those who profess to be experts in technology evaluate technological risks, they actually are much more conservative in their assessment than all the other expertise domains. Flip it around, another way is, if you take economists and you ask them to evaluate economic risks, they tend to rate, in terms of their impact and likelihood, much higher than the other groups. I have no explanation for this, but intuitively I think that in some degrees, it's, someone said to me, and I asked a few university professors, and they said, well, look, technologists, most of them are engineers, problem solvers, so they're not going to sort of look at and sort of highlight some of these things and be alarmist, but be kind of cold and analytical. And I said, well, I don't know what it tells us, but it's very, I think, revealing to me that this community that you're part of, you tend to look at your elements of risk in a much more conservative way. It's a relative term, unconservative, than, let's say, economists who evaluate global economic risks, or political scientists who evaluate geopolitical risk. The second thing I want to talk about is that obviously, technological risks are not just necessarily about the cyber piece, but we'll talk about that today. But I want to just pick out a news piece that came to my mind, and you probably saw it recently. There was there's a consortium of companies and investors in the United States who are now exploring the notion of going to outer space and to mine asteroids and the like for precious minerals and metals. And that was part, of course, one of our risks here is the mineral resource supply vulnerability. So you could see why that probably reflects why in the market today people are willing to do something. It's a crazy idea is to send out spacecraft to mine asteroids. And we know the story here, particularly in your industries, how important these rare metals are. They're not quite rare, but they just happen to be mostly mined in one part of the world. And we are seeing that there's vulnerabilities there. But what I found critical is that the same group is not motivated by this piece, this low-level proliferation of orbital debris. Because if you operate in space, that's one thing that's going to be a big problem. It's a commons. We are seeing more and more debris in the orbits that matter in outer space. And you probably appreciate that the speeds of these very little pieces of the debris can do and what they can do to vehicles. And I mentioned that because when I came here via a conference in Singapore called the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is basically the defense establishment, very concerned about cyber, but they're also concerned about this because they understand that all of their weapon systems deal with, it's really about their capability to see into the future and operate, rely on GPS and other satellite systems. And so there is a debate about how do you manage in commons of that, because there have been demonstrations by some governments to actually go up and shoot down a satellite. And of course, when they shoot down a satellite, no one's there to collect the debris. It's just out there. And we've seen roughly a double in terms of the number of debris. But I just mentioned that you have certain things that it's an illustration to me, and I hope to you, that we'll be driven by one major sort of global risk, but we need to always be aware of the others. And that's the purpose of this report, to give you a complete picture, to see how these risks interrelate. Now, a little bit of my metaphor. I mentioned the centers of gravity, so I'm going to start and say this is sort of the astronomy lesson. I'll get to the astrology lesson in a moment. The astronomy lesson is that when we did ask about which risk was most systemically important within a subset of risks, we also saw that there are other risks in other domains that are very connected. So critical systems failure in the technology space was seen as the one risk that actually impacts all the others significantly. But and you see that though major systemic financial failure on the economic side is drawn by this. You see that global governance failure is drawn by this in terms of from the perspective of the geopolitical risk section. So we're starting to see that there are certain risks that are first among equals to some degree, not only in their own category, but they influence sort of the movements of others. Thus sort of this planetary metaphor about the center of gravity. And hence this picture that we all probably thinking back in our elementary school charts of the solar system. I highlight here that the methods change. This is a time series of where we've said the top global risks over the years. I just want to point out again, 2012, we have a whole new method. I hope in the future myself or a colleague can come brief you on 13, 14, but you'll be able to see movement there. What I did want to point out is that certain things, these exercises are still on a 10-year time horizon, and we're not predicting, but what was interesting is in 2009, 10, fiscal crises, very much on the radar screen among the 30-some odd risks. 2012 pops up in terms of the impact right there in 2011. Now, maybe I say that I'm in Europe, and I think that's very much the discussion on the day. I'm not saying it's predictive, but I think it does say something to me that it was up there among the top 5. It shoots up as the biggest concern in 11, and here we're on 12 trying to deal and grapple with it. And in this context, we see, now again the definitions change, but we see the chronic fiscal imbalance as a condition, and major systemic failure in 2012. And this survey, just to give you a sense, was conducted in September of 2011 and 10, and we revealed the results in 2012. And it was meant to look at a 10-year horizon, but here we are today. What I thought was interesting, likelihood, and we've always had a very interesting trend pattern here, but I want to just show that for now we see cyber attacks as one of the ones as a very high instance in likelihood in this new methodology. Very important, and I think for this audience, because you are constantly working with your constituents, your leadership, to get them to understand this, and I hope that our report can help you in that effort, because today we live in an age where online information, the online world is a global commons, and we have to make all our efforts to really preserve that commons. But here, I just wanted to highlight that piece. Part of the reason we think is maybe just the overall awareness, both in the press and just the statistics of that. If we look at just in the case of the United States, the cost and incidence of cybercrime is increasing. But it's important because the report that I have is obviously gets the attention of leaders in places like Davos, but it's meant for a lay audience. The lessons that we try to express in our report, I hope your uncles, grandparents, children would sort of all digest, because it's an important effort to get a really common base understanding of how we are interconnected and how important that there is a broad awareness of these global risks, because that's really going to be the established enabling environment for your organizations and your leaders to take the risk to actually deal with risks. So I mentioned the first part was a bit about the astronomy, where I laid out the planets and such. And a little bit, I will say, the interpretive piece, I'd kind of go into the bit that this is a little bit of, maybe astrology is the better metaphor. But what we try to do with these cases, we take the results of our survey and its analysis and to create 3 cases that the general public can understand. One of the cases was around the dark side of connectivity, because we felt that we live in a world where the impacts of crime, terrorism, and even war in the virtual world may come to a point where they equal the impacts in the physical world, and the public needs to be aware of that. Second, the hyperconnectivity is a reality. I mean, we know that population has increased. We're on the trajectory. We've passed 6 billion, going on towards 9 billion, but right now we have 5 billion people on mobile phones, and that trend is going to continue on. And so this is one level of just getting the public's attention around this and leaders. Back to the chart. So this is where we took the landscape that you saw, the 2x2, the X and Y axes, and we looked at the connectivity. We then had a team of researchers to go down further and say, look, this is great. It tells you that the whole world is connected and we got lots of risks to worry about. What a mess. It's not very helpful for the likes of you. It's not the right context. We then went through a number of methods to get down to the connections that we think revealed something. The constellations of risks in this big risk universe, this universe that we thought we needed to go further and analyze. And this is what we arrived at, this global risk constellation, where we saw that the cyber attacks, one of the technological risks, massive incidents of data fraud or theft, and digital misinformation were all part of the story connecting to the critical systems failure, which was the center of gravity, as you know, in terms of the global risk. But we also had it link into concerns around governance, particularly around terrorism, the failure of conflict resolution, and global governance failure. And we then identified, and this is a little bit, it's the interpretive piece, and that's why I mentioned Charlie, that these are what we think are the origin risks, increasing capabilities for cybercrime and attacks, that they manifest themselves in their connection through pathways where the balance of power tips as new actors can wage effective interference and disrupt commerce, and they manifest really challenging governments and global governance itself. And so this is the story we arrived at to help, we hope, to help the public understand and interpret and analyze the data that emerged from our survey. But we wanted, at least at the end of the day, have two teaching lessons for the public. And they're very simple ones, and you all know them and very familiar, but any device with a software-defined behavior can be tricked into doing things its creators did not intend. It's important that the public understands this. It's this is the big public health message about, don't smoke, it can lead to cancer kind of stuff, but they need to just be aware of that at a minimum. And the second is any device connected to a network or of any sort in any way can be compromised by an external party. And we have some experts here that'll talk about this, and many such compromises have not yet been detected. We just need that level of awareness. That's the purpose of that case, is to let you know that that's the two rules that you're going to live with in a hyper-connected world. And of course, we have some parts that here I want to share. Of course, connectivity is increasing in the internet. And you're familiar with that number. But what behind that, of course, is the fact that the planet is on the trajectory from 6 to 9 billion people. So if you see that increasing, then we're going to have in absolute terms a significant increase in those that are connected. But the lesson we wanted to impart to the public, however, was that it's the Internet of Things. It's the devices. All the things we love and see that's connecting is really what's, and that number is at 16 billion, right? Well, multiples above the human population. And so that's why those two earlier axioms are important, because we're going to go into this era of connectivity, and the Internet of Things is very important for just people to be aware of. The other element is that people read about cyber attacks. We thought it was important for the public and at least leaders to understand their various natures. Now, I can't claim that we have to cover them all, but familiar ones of sabotage, espionage, and subversion. The point, though, I want to highlight in this is the importance of obviously dealing with these issues, particularly in the press and others, in their particular context. Context obviously clearly matters. I came from, again, this meeting in East Asia, where the big discussion around this was an incident that happened quite recently in Korea, in Seoul, which is very close, as you're aware of, into the border of the 30th parallel with the North Korea. And that there was efforts to jam the GPS system, which did lead to rerouting of flights into Seoul Incheon Airport and Gimpo Airport, but also a disrupted navigation of fishing flotillas and other merchant vessels that were going to the port of Incheon. Really big concern because they felt, of course, if it's North Korea, if it's agents of North Korea, now they've recently arrested some people in South Korea who are selling the equipment, but they don't really know who was doing the jamming. It's no longer just about the public. You are in a situation where great instability, where if it is interpreted as beyond, if put it another way, it's one of those things that you can't countenance that it could lead to real conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And that conflict, as you're well aware, involves great powers like China and the United States, but also nuclear weapons is a possibility. So I think one of the things that we're trying to also say is be aware of these things, but also start to also focus on the context of how these things and these incidents emerge. And that's, again, part of the lesson we want to impart to the public. Now, on all of this, what we can do, our stakeholders, is to try to have at least some sort of framework. And the framework is to understand what kinds of the threats there are, the vulnerabilities, the values at risk, your assets, your reputation, and your responses. And I just share that with you. It's in our report. We have a report on cyber resilience. But I think one of the things we can do is not only put the dots out there and connect them in some sense-making, but we also help and develop with our stakeholders a conceptual framework to address the constellation of risks that we've surfaced. The other thing is some basic principles, because I think a lot of our, again, simple messages is what we're about at least the global level, to supplement the models and to supplement the sense-making through the analysis, and there is really some basic rules, maybe some, I would call them principles, to some extreme make them into norms, but we have others who are going to look at the behavior, because behavior really matters. One of the things we highlighted just at the beginning of the report for the general public was that, if in your household, if your children still, they know that if they walked into a store and took a DVD and walked out of it without paying for it, that's theft. Do they also know that if they went and hacked into or actually downloaded something without the permission, without payment, that too is that theft? And that really, so there is a basic awareness that has to happen. But here, this is of course more for the business and public sector to think about. And these are principles that we recently published a report last week in Bangkok at the occasion of a World Economic Forum on East Asia, a report on cyber resilience. And this is where we focused on these 4 principles. And I won't walk you through, but they're co-developed and co-designed with all the stakeholders. So on the flip side of that, we had the private sector recommendations, and this was in consultation with the public sector. The key lesson here is that your forum, the ability to bring together all the stakeholders, will make for much better, prudent design. And I really salute the organizers here to organize this event every year, because the public-private partnership is necessary, not just on implementation, but on co-design and norm sharing. Again, on the public sector piece here, we have the discussions on what we think are what, and this is informed by private sector and non-business input. And then there are some questions for stakeholders that we have in this year's report, which I hope which we are asking a variety of universities and experts to answer, or try to answer next year's board. We want to continue this. Our report, we try to look at it as a textbook to some degree. So we left questions at the end of the chapter without giving people the teacher's handbook, but next year we'll have that element. And I hope that we can count on some of you to give us your ideas into how you would address these dilemmas in policy. And I won't speak to them, because some of these have been raised and continue to be raised in the panel discussions, and they'll be raised in the subsequent presentations. But I wanted to highlight that we do think what you're doing also has a broader purpose in terms of the general education of the public, but also educating leaders. So I want to thank you for the opportunity, and I'll close here, and I'm happy to entertain any questions. So thank you very much.
I think we have 2 or 3 minutes for questions. ¿Alguna pregunta?
Oh, sorry. Okay. I think we have 2 or 3 minutes for questions. So do you have any questions in the public? This one.
Gentleman in the back.
Microphone. Other one and other. So let's do first over there. Bueno, quiero apuntar que creo que estaremos todos de acuerdo en que la presencia del World Economic Forum es fundamental. Hemos comentado antes con varios compañeros en el café que realmente esto es lo que necesitamos. Al final, la alta dirección, el consejero delegado, pues no lee lamentablemente ni el Computer World ni Red Seguridad, ni la revista SIG, pero será más fácil llegar a ellos a través de los informes y de los resúmenes ejecutivos que hace el World Economic Forum, en el que habla sobre los riesgos tecnológicos, sobre la seguridad, sobre los ciberataques, de modo que sin duda nos apoyan en nuestra misión de elevar la seguridad de la información. Así que antes, por eso hemos trasladado nuestro sincero agradecimiento al World Economic Forum por haber aceptado la invitación. Adelante.
My name is Marcio Viegas from BSI, British Standards. Well, first of all, congratulations, because I think the change you made in the new report is really important, not just visually. I think it's more visual now, but also the methodology is more complete. And I have actually read the report, and we had an event 2 or 3 months ago about the risk management. And the content of your report was key for us to introduce the global and general risks to the wider audience. But my question is really about the solutions. I know this is just a diagnosis report, and you're not there to predicate solutions, but how do you see practical solutions or things like standards, by the way, and the EU directive on infrastructures? How do you see the implementation of these potential solutions answering to the 5 or mainly to the information problems you see in your report? Thank you.
Thank you. Quickly on that, I think it's really contextualization. The next phase is that next year you will see a regional analysis from all the major regions of the world of this report, and we're also developing industry analyses. I think if we can take, for example, and possibly country analyses, for example, we'll do ASEAN, and we will also have a focus on Japan, etc. And then we'll also do work on certain sectors, energy sector, mining, minerals, and we'll interpret that. We'll go down a layer. The challenge will be for those who have principal responsibilities like you and your enterprises and your organizations, is we're trying to figure out a way that we can come down as close as we can to your needs so that you can connect in and interface with us. So right now we are actually too high, but no one will produce that analysis. We're unique and we're able to do that because it's critical, because otherwise you're just going to be risk takers in terms of looking at this. The next level is bring it down to the region, to the country context, or the industry, then sectoral context. Then we can start to interface with organizations such as this to get to that prescriptive piece. Because to your point, we need to, the call is not the diagnostic piece, but actually get to the prescriptive. Now we can have, part of that is our convening powers, the World Economic Forum. We can bring together the various actors, and we do, but we need to do it in the proper context. The second piece I would share on this is that we also look at measures to have a more dynamic assessment. This is a yearly annual checkup that comes out in January. How can we keep and monitor these global risks? What are the data? What kind of data are there? Proxies that we can use? So we're actually working with a consortium of universities. I have about 15 National University of Singapore, Keio University, Oxford University, Carnegie Mellon, MIT, RPI in the United States, among others, are all knowledge partners of ours in trying to figure out a way that we can actually manage the measurement, the continual measurement of these risks, but also, to close, is that help us convene in terms of some practices around this. But again, we're just trying to go from X-ray to MRI so that you, as sort of the consulting physician, had a better field to deal with the issue. If I could use that metaphor again, but that would be my answer.
Hi, good morning, Lee. Thank you for your presentation. It was very, very impressive. Allow me to share a thought with you, and then I will do my question because they are related. I think that you have mentioned that we need senior management support to develop a long-term risk treatment strategy. I do agree with you, but I think that we are demanding our senior management lot of support in get involvement into risk management, business continuity, information security, data privacy. They also have, I think they will have time to run a company in between all those involvements. And The question is that many of the threats that you have identified in the previous year were focused on the last shiny incident that came out of the press. I mean, we can read this crisis in terms of petrol price rise, the Iceland volcano. I mean, what can we do to do a really long-term risk treatment strategy that can survive the next incident that came around us in a couple of months? Because a new incident will happen for sure, and that new incident may distract us from the long-term risk treatment strategy we already have in place.
Yeah, absolutely. The question that ponders yours, absolutely. I think the next phase of the global risk report is a research exercise. The actual piece of the risk response network, where we bring our stakeholders together, is to examine principally the issue of resilience, because you really, you can't, many of these, there's no way you're going to completely manage or mitigate. Mm-hmm. So, and this is the community that talks a lot about resilience, I know, but we're also working with the different stakeholders to say, what are the factors of resilience? I could share with you, for example, next we have another report called the Global Competitiveness Report, which looks at the competitiveness of national economies and a variation of factors. But we did ask a risk question this year to ask the business communities of each country to assess the government's ability to deal with complex risk of global crises. And we will use that as a starting point to have a conversation around to different stakeholders, particularly government, about what they see as sort of fundamentals in terms of resilience, but also talking to our industries and members of why they felt these governments were better or not. One of the things that it's revealed, this whole process has revealed to us, is that lots to do more on this issue of resilience, and even getting a shared definition and understanding of it. What are the factors of resilience and understanding that? Point one. Point two, it's also revealed to me that it's hard to have conversations with organizations about risk, just generally, even governments or not. There's no single repository of sort of risk knowledge or oversight responsibility in government. Very few have a kind of a chief risk officer. Even in the corporates, that CRO could be more of a finance function and linked to the CFO to purchase sort of risks, protection in the financial markets, or it could be someone else in the operating side or the CTO. It's not, we're just learning. And the other piece you raised, awareness, boards, the board level people, the chairman we talk to, and the sort of CEOs that we deal with, they also have a very different look. I mean, obviously, the boards are very interested in big systemic existential risk, but all they do is then say, that's important. Now then they look to the C-suite to sort of figure out, what do we have a plan for this? And of course, then that's where we get the blowback. So, well, look, how do we connect with what you're saying and doing, and how can you, it's all about making this kind of research more meaningful, and that's really the process that we're embarking on going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. It was a pleasure to hear you.